Okay, so we left off in section one, talking about the Munich Conference. The Munich Conference took place in September of 1938. Okay, so the war is going to begin when Germany invades Poland in 1939. And then, of course, it's going to go until the end, until 1945. Okay, so anyway, just prior to September, it was in August 23rd, 1939, the Soviets and the Nazis signed this non-aggression pact. This shocked the entire world, and I love this political cartoon. Hitler and Stalin right here. Wonder how long that relationship will last, right? So anyway, they signed this agreement that neither country is going to attack the other for a period of at least 10 years. Of course, Hitler's going to violate that. But anyway, Stalin wanted to have time to build up his military, and Hitler wanted to be able to invade Poland unchallenged, right? They also made a secret agreement uh, to divide up Eastern Europe. And as the war ends and Hitler is and the Nazis are defeated, Stalin's going to go in and take over Eastern Europe, and those are going to become Soviet bloc nations. All right, so on September 1st, 1939, so this is just after, because let's see, it was August that there was the non-aggression pact. So it's 1 month later, less than 1 month, it's like a week later, Hitler comes in, with lightning speed, this lightning war, Germans call it Blitzkrieg. Krieg is war, right? So they come in with this lightning speed and they invade Poland. Really, there was nothing Poland could really do to resist. So they come and they take that territory, which once was part of the German Empire, part of Prussia. All right, so they take that. He wanted all this lost territory that was lost as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. Now, France and England had promised Poland that if there was an invasion, that they would aid in defending them. So England and France declare war against Germany on September 3rd, and this is when the war begins. Russia comes in and it takes the eastern part of Poland September 17th of 1939, but they didn't declare war on the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is going to end up allying themselves with England and France once Hitler makes a mistake of invading the Soviet Union. All right, so here you see the Nazis, the German troops, in kind of coming in to Poland. They goose step, they march like that without bending their knees. Our army doesn't do that. All right, so what to do? What should the United States do? So initially, we were pledging our neutrality. So what we get instead, okay, cash and carry. We will allow you the equipment that you need to fight the war, to fight the Nazis, as long as there is no debt, right? So the American government allowed businesses and banks or whatever, well, there was no banks, there was no lending taking place as there was in World War I. And it's huge debate, right? Because a lot of people wanted to remain neutral. So we get this cash and carry, no credit, right? And they had to transport things on their own ships. American ships wouldn't be involved the way that they were in World War I. So we're trying not to get involved, but it is starting to bring more and more Americans into the war effort, and our factories start to churn out equipment for England and France to fight the war, and it starts to bring us out of the Great Depression. All right, so initially it looked like, okay, the war started in September of 1939, and people called it a phony war because there's no fighting that was taking place. But then that all ends in the spring of 1940 as the Nazis go up, they invade Denmark, right, which is just north there. If you guys don't know your maps, of Europe. Many of you probably do. So they go up into Denmark right here, right? And then into Norway. Sweden pledged its independent, or they were independent, and people respected that. And then the Nazis go into France, and of course they had gone into Poland. But then Russia takes eastern Poland and then also takes Finland, right? And Finland is this, whoops, is this country right here. And so that's Finland. Okay, and here's another map of it showing how they came in and invaded, right? So Congress appropriates money for Finland for non-military supplies, right? But there's nothing that the Finnish people could really do to ward off the Soviets coming in there. Germany invades Denmark, Norway, as I said, and this is April of 1940, and then they're poised to attack France, right, as they go through Belgium, the same way they did in World War I. Right. So the Germans had this false sense of security because they had built up this huge fortification system, what became known as the Maginot Line, or what is known as the Maginot Line, right here on their border. But then Germany does the same thing they did in World War I. They just go through with the Schlieffenplan. They go through the Netherlands and they go through Belgium, and then this time they're very successful. They go right into Paris, and there's really nothing that the French could do but surrender because they came in with just such speed, and they were ill prepared for this war. They hadn't built up their military. They started to, but it was too late. Right, so these are some images from the Maginot Line. The fortifications are just amazing along there. They had underground railroads, as you can see in this top picture up there. There's a corridor inside one of the forts. You can go down there, little rail lines that would transport men and equipment from one fortified bunker to another, and it's just mile after mile after mile. They still have these. They still are there, and you can go for tourist reasons and you can view them. Okay, so they didn't do that. And then as the Germans are on the march, you've got the British Army here in the northern part of France, and they are pushed to the sea. And they're trapped right there at Dunkirk as the Germans are just kind of closing in and closing in and closing in on them. And that's most of the British Army, right? 330,000 soldiers. And they don't have the Navy. Winston Churchill, who's prime minister at the time, he appeals to FDR. He says, we need some ships. We need to help evacuating our army. And FDR is like, I can't, that we can't get involved. There's nothing that we can do. And so there's this cry throughout England, we need anybody to come and assist to help to evacuate. And so they're able to do that with some naval and mostly civilian vessels, as you're going to see. Let me go to this next picture. So here are some images of the evacuation of Dunkirk, which they call the miracle of Dunkirk. So there was a rallying cry of the people of England. They said, please, send your ships, do what you can. They couldn't get too many military ships there. The Germans came in with the planes and they were bombing them. And so what these people did, they relinquished their boats, or they sailed their boats across the English Channel, little pleasure cruise, boats. The people just have their civilian boats here going across the channel. They tied them together and they were tugged, or they did whatever they could, and they evacuated the people. Had they not, it could have been over, right? Because that was essentially England's army, and so they were able to evacuate, and that's why it's called a miracle. And so it's basically England is on their own, right? Right at that time, because France had been defeated. Okay, so here, the fall of France, the Germans push in towards Paris. They appealed to the United States for assistance, but we didn't send any aid. England thought that FDR would help, but FDR said, no, we could just send some military aid, but we can't send any troops. And so what the French did is they thought it's best just to sue for peace. So on June 14th, 1940, France falls to Germany. And you can see right there, German troops marching down the Champs-Élysées, a very famous boulevard in Paris, right through the Arc de Triomphe right there. That's where the confluence, like 12 different streets come together. So it's a very famous location in the city of Paris. And then, of course, Hitler comes there, and he's there right at the Eiffel Tower. So the French people were just devastated by this. So what they established like a puppet government in the south of France. The Germans take over the northern part, but in the south they have what's known as the Vichy government, and it's ruled by Henri Pétain, and he is a co-fascist leader of this region, right? So they work very, very closely with the Germans for industrial purposes, and they aid in fighting the Axis. But as the war kind of progresses, we get people turning over to the Free French cause. So this is a resistance movement. So this is Henry Baton up there on the left, Marshal Baton, and the Vichy France is the area in the green on the right. And those are the ones that allied with Germany initially in the war. But this is Charles de Gaulle right up here, the top left, and the flag right here was altered for the purpose. This was the Free French movement. And so this was a group of people who were French fighters who were fighting the French underground against the Germans. They were kind of doing guerrilla warfare tactics against the Germans throughout France, and they just harassed them throughout the course of the war. They're also known as the Marquis. All right, and then what we get is a tripartite pact in 1940, and this is between Japan, Germany, and Italy. And you see right there Emperor Hirohito on our left, and then Hitler in the middle, and then Benito Mussolini on the right. So Japan allies itself with Germany and Italy, believing then that the Soviet Union would not do anything to interfere with Japan taking over parts of China and other places in the Pacific. And um, they were right. So, with the invasion of France and the takeover of that country by the Nazis and England all on its own, it becomes pretty apparent that the United States needs to do something. And so, Roosevelt encouraged Congress, he appeals to Congress for funding to start building up the military. And so, Congress appropriates $37 billion to start building up our Air Force and then also a two ocean navy. So we start creating destroyers and aircraft carriers and everything else. And what this does, it starts to bring us again further and further out of the Great Depression as we're gearing up for this. So this was a huge sum of money, right? More than it cost for all of World War I. Not only that, we get the first peacetime draft in our nation's history. It's in September of 1940, right? So it's a year after the war in Europe had begun, but it's after, the invasion of France, the fall of France. So this is the first peacetime draft, and what they do is they train 1.2 million soldiers and 800,000 reservists annually is what they do. We also continue to pursue a good neighbor policy, and there's a conference of a lot of Latin American nations in Havana, Cuba, in 1940, and here we unilaterally impose the Monroe Doctrine, but it's not basically for our benefit, it is for the benefit of our neighbors here in the Western Hemisphere. Basically, we're pledging our support to aid them, which they needed the aid because many of them, their ties to Europe that had been long established were now gone, right? Because the Nazis had basically taken over Europe and control of these powers. So they were looking to the United States for assistance in their defense. And so England's all on its own with this new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. And what the Germans do, they begin this bombing campaign of England. This is known as the Battle of Britain. It begins in August of 1940. So they start initially looking at military targets, transportation links, airports, railroad stations, armaments plants, and that sort of thing. But then they just start bombing the cities, and we're thinking this is horrible. First there was Guernica in Spain, and now they're just bombing all these civilian targets, and it was devastating. This is when the British people start to send their children out of the cities into the countryside. That's the movie Narnia, or the book Narnia. Okay, so what you just heard was an air drill, right? So when the planes were coming, that was notification to the British people, hey, you need to take cover, right? And so the people are there all the time looking for that, right? So this is known as the Battle of Britain and also the Blitz. As people, they lived in fear. By the way, that was also Winston Churchill speaking. So here you see two ladies walking in rubble in the city of London, and then London on fire, locations there that are burning. People took to the tube or the subway for defense down there. They'd sleep in it at night. Obviously, the trains weren't going through. And the Royal Air Force is the ones, what they did, they were really successful at staving off a German attack. So once they knew that the Germans were coming, then they would get into their planes and they would have dogfights up there in the air to try to prevent the Germans from coming over and bombing the cities. And so there was a lot of fighting that took place in the English Channel. So they were very, very brave in what they did. They'd have to be ready just in an instant to get in the planes and go and fight against the German Luftwaffe. And here's Winston Churchill. He really was a great leader for the British people at this time, leading them through World War II. And this sign right here means V. It's not the peace sign, it's V for victory. And he was famous for saying or for giving that signal. Okay, and here's a couple of posters, quotes of Churchill towards the Royal Air Force. Never was so much owed by so many to so few, and let us go forward together. So trying to give the British people some encouragement because they are on their own, right? And he's working closely with Roosevelt, trying to get some assistance and some aid. Right. So, but the Americans are debating what sort of support should we give to Britain at this time. So, there is a committee to defend America by aiding the Allies, and they're kind of in opposition to the American First Committee. So, anyway, what people wanted to do was in the committee to defend America, they wanted to appeal to both sides. Let's aid England and go as far as just being in war. But then other people argued that England would fight to the last, and so they did not want to get involved in war at all. Right, so people are in opposition. They're debating: should we get involved? Should we not get involved? And so, huge debate. All right, so we start to get a little bit more involved. Remember, it's cash and carry. Now it's destroyers for bases. And what this was, the British said, okay, how about we give you land or access to different bases in the Caribbean if you could just give us some destroyers, right? Or loan it to us, right? So Roosevelt agreed to transfer to Great Britain, as it says here, 50 old modeled um, destroyers to them. These are the ones that were left over from World War I. This was a violation of our neutrality. Britain agreed to provide the United States with these bases for 99 years. Some are in Latin America, others were in Canada, one in Newfoundland up there in Canada. And then we get the election in 1940. So remember that Roosevelt was elected initially in 1932 and then reelected in 1936. So it's a big debate. Does he run again? No president had ever run for a third term, but he decides to go ahead and do that. He's running against Wendell Willkie, the Republican. And if you look right up here, you can see that he won, Roosevelt did, by a pretty good margin in the Electoral College and even in the popular vote. He wins by quite a bit. Whenever you can get more than 50, 51%, you're doing fairly well in presidential elections. Okay, and this is Wendell Willkie right here. The Republicans condemn FDR being like a dictator, right? And then the costs of the New Deal and everything else, and all the legislation they were concerned about, the violations they saw to the Constitution, right? The Democrats criticized Willkie as being a rich man's Roosevelt. Of course, Roosevelt was very rich, right? So he announced that he wanted a third term just because of the graveness of the situation, and we were in this crisis. So that's why he was seeking a third term. Okay, so we had first cash and carry, then we had destroyers for bases. Now we have lend lease, right? Because Britain is all on their own, and they couldn't pay for these supplies. There was nothing that they could do. So what Roosevelt said we're going to do, he came up with this plan where we're going to give armaments to the democracies, which would be returned after the war. We're going to lend you a destroyer. We're going to lend you these sorts of things. So it was promoted as an act to further promote the defense of the United States, right? So it was for our benefit. It was really debated again because there were people who were for getting involved, but there were people who just wanted American neutrality and not to get involved in any war whatsoever with any European country. All right, so this is Lend-Lease. We started giving a lot of money to people fighting against uh, Germany and the Nazis there. So we give Great Britain the most, $31 billion, the Soviet Union, 11 billion, France, 3 billion. It was hard to decide who to give that money to, right? Because they had a puppet government in place, so it was very difficult. China, too, was fighting Japan, so gave 1.5 to them. Latin America. So it was a lot of money. So we're going into deep, deep deficit spending. So this is definitely Keynesian economics, right? As we're plunging deeper, deeper into debt at this time. Okay, and here's another thing kind of showing the money going to different countries from American taxpayer coffers. Right. Okay. So Germany, then, this is probably one of the biggest mistakes that Hitler did. There was territorial disputes and tensions between the Soviet Union and Germany in Poland and in other locations as Germany continued to push eastward and take up more territory. So what Hitler does is he decides to invade the Soviet Union. This is known as Operation Barbarossa, and we pledged our support to the Soviets, and we send them like $11 billion. Germany, or the Soviets, were able to halt eventually Germany, but they suffered very heavy casualties. The Soviet Union suffered more than any other country in terms of death in World War II. Okay, this is the map of Operation Barbarossa. That was the name of it as the Germans came in with their lightning war and they just poured troops and equipment into the Soviet Union. You could see the line too that they got to. They almost got to Moscow, right? Some of the worst fighting was up here in Leningrad and then down here in what became in Stalingrad. Millions of people would die in those areas, civilians and military. All right, so here you see the Germans coming in with their Panzer tanks, right? So they assault the Soviets, and this is June 22nd, 1941. He wants to get control of Western Russia, right? Because he wants to repopulate it with the German people. So he sends in 3 million German soldiers and 3,400 tanks, as I said, June of 1941. Okay, so the writing's on the wall. FDR can see what's happening, even though the American people want neutrality. FDR is preparing for the inevitable, knowing that it's going to have to happen. So we solidify our alliance with England and the Allied powers. They get together on a boat in the Atlantic and they come up with the Atlantic Charter. And so basically, these are their goals for the war. And then one of them is to have a worldwide organization similar to the League of Nations. So what's going to come out of it is, of course, the United Nations. Okay, so here Churchill and FDR are meeting together on that boat. Would have been loved to have been a fly on the wall with that meeting. But anyway, here they promised no territorial annexations, no territorial changes. The people could choose their own form of government. You could also the right to regain your government abolished by the dictator. So how they're going to fix things, and then of course they want a permanent international organization, so they want the United Nations. So America is getting slowly pulled into the war. So Germany is doing kind of the same thing that they did in the precursor to World War I. They start attacking our ships, right? First, the Robert Moore was attacked in May of 1941, and then we start to convoy ships to England in September from Iceland, right? This was a decision that FDR made as the commander-in-chief as a defensive measure. And then the German submarine fires upon fires upon the USS Greer. And Roosevelt said, shoot on sight, rather than suffer any attacks. If you see a German submarine, you're free to do that. So basically partake in this effort. And then the Kearney gets into a fight with the German U-boat in October of 1941. And then the Reuben James is torpedoed and sunk off the coast of Iceland in October. And then Congress allowed the U.S. to ship and sail. Congress gave the authority for U.S. ships to sail into these combat zones. So we're getting more and more involved in it. And of course, in December of 1941, we're going to declare war on Japan and its allies, which of course is going to be Germany and Italy. So because of the embargo that was placed on Japan, Japan had to save face. They had been expanding in the Pacific. They'd taken Manchuria. They'd taken parts of mainland China. They had gone into Korea. They had taken French Indonesia. They were moving on to the Philippines, right? Because of the embargo, they wanted to save face, and they attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Again, they were expanding because they wanted these natural resources. Between November and the attack, there were negotiations that were going on, and the United States demanded that they withdraw from China. That would have been humiliating for them in their eyes and their culture, because you're not supposed to surrender, you're not supposed to give in. And so Japan is poised to attack the United States, but we're not sure where. I think most people kind of knew, but it was still it was a shock and a surprise when they did do it. So much of what we know about the attack comes from the Japanese themselves. This picture right here was taken from a cockpit of a Japanese plane, right? So the bombers attack on the early morning. It's a Sunday, December 7th, 1941 at Pearl Harbor. I think it was around 8 o'clock in the morning, right? So there are 360 Japanese planes were launched from aircraft carriers out in the Pacific. And radar, which was pretty new at the time, had kind of picked something up, but they weren't sure what it was. So they start bombing our ships that are lined up in the harbors. And then in the military, we line things up in a very orderly way, dress right dress, so they could go to an airstrip and get a whole bunch of planes at a time. They could go and they could get ships at a time. A lot of our Pacific fleet, though, was off doing maneuvers, so they were not attacked, but they did sink and damage 18 ships, which included, as you can see right here, 8 battleships, 3 light cruisers, 3 destroyers, 161 planes, damaged 102, right? But they were able to get them up and running, many of them in pretty record time after this attack. All total, 2,117 U.S. deaths, and 1,200 of them were on the USS Arizona. Okay, so that was a radio announcement to the American people, letting them know what happened. This right here is a map of Pearl Harbor, and you can see where the ships are. So this is where the USS Arizona is. So as the planes come in, they're coming in from this location from the north, and they're going to come in and attack. Right. So if you go there today, there's a location right here, and it's the visitor center, and it will take you over to where the USS Arizona is still sunk, right there in Pearl Harbor. The military commander that planned this operation was Yamamoto, and he became arch enemy number 1. Americans just despised the Japanese, and they wanted to get Japan first, but it's planned that once we do get involved in the war, we agreed that we would first go after Europe and send kind of a force fighting back the Japanese to halt their advance, and then we would turn all of our attention on Japan. But the American people were really angry. Okay, here's another image. This is from, here I told you where that was. This right here is the USS Arizona that's going to get hit. Right, so this is from a Japanese cockpit. This is FDR. So that was FDR, and that was his appeal to Congress for a declaration of war, which he gets. So this is the USS Arizona at Pearl Harbor. It was struck with a torpedo, which caused it to sink, and 1,200 people on board lost their lives. This is FDR signing the Declaration of War, and this is December 8th, 1971 or 41, the day after Pearl Harbor was attacked. And this is where I'm not sure which aircraft carrier that is. It might be the Nimitz. But this right here is the memorial that is in place at the USS Arizona. This is a dock right here where if you go to the visitor center, you take the boat out there and then you can go and visit the memorial, and it has all the names of those who lost their lives inscribed on the wall. It's very solemn. Okay, and then this you can see this is the memorial right on top of the Arizona. The bodies that were in the below the belly of the ship, they left there, right? It's still leaking oil. I'm assuming that the bodies have decomposed. Okay, thank you.